about this project and how it got going. When I took over as editor-in-chief at the Norwegian American, I started specking out the editorial calendar, and I thought, how am I getting a lot of people interested in what we're doing? How am I going to get a lot of hits on our website? And I thought of cookies immediately. So, because Christmas baking is so much part of the Scandinavian tradition. So we decided we were going to have a Christmas cookie extravaganza issue. And we started planning it in the summertime. We enlisted all kinds of help. We got our best food contributors and bloggers. Kristi was one of them. And we also got our friends involved. Julie Albright was one of the bakers. And we got Kristi Leander involved. We all got together at her house and staged this amazing spread here. And it was really fun, and it was really successful. Boy, did we get hits on our website. I think over 100,000 that month.
Wow.
So, let's see. We have to move forward. So, that was November 27th last year. And we presented a baker's dozen of Scandinavian Christmas cookies. Many of the cookies are the same in all of the Nordic countries. 5 months of planning total. And as I said, recipes from our staff and favorite contributors. The tradition of baking for Yule in Scandinavia is a long and very important one. They started very early with it. What's the date today? It's September 15th. They didn't start that early, but this is a Swedish Club, so we do. They usually got started about the beginning of November with their Christmas baking. And the tradition in Sweden is to have Krunkakka, 7 types of cookie. Judith just asked me why, and I don't really know. It's a magical number. There's 7 days in the week, and it does turn out very magical, and it doesn't look chintzy when you present 7 cookies to your guests. For the extravaganza, we did a baker's dozen, so we doubled it and added one. Many of the cookies that we think are Swedish or Norwegian or Danish or Finnish, they have their origins outside of Scandinavia. The pepperkake that we love first came to Bergen on the west coast of Norway with the merchants who brought the spices. They brought it up from Germany. The first cookies were made with iron plates, and then others were made with leavening agents later on. So what is the famous cookie that the Norwegians make that's been Krunkakka? It's over 1,000 years old. And even though we're at the Swedish Club tonight, we're going to learn how to make good Krunkakka because we all love them in the Nordic community here. And we're going to talk about 3 Swedish Christmas cookies. So then in the 1800s, stoves and ovens became more available. Cookbooks became more popular, and this tradition really took off in homes all over Scandinavia. And sugar came in with the Industrial Revolution. There was more money and a higher standard of living, and they haven't stopped baking and eating Christmas cookies since then. So at that, I am so honored to present Kristi. I think it's absolutely amazing that she agreed to come out all the way from Omaha. So she's going to give you her special tips. She has a wonderful food blog called True North Kitchen. And as you can see, she has a great love for Sweden with the dollar horse on her logo. And they are simple, seasonal, Nordic-inspired recipes. She's an attorney by training and a chef by passion. So at that, I'm going to turn this over to Kristi.
Thank you so much for having me. It was no hardship to come to Seattle. I've never been here before. It was, an easy yes. and I might try to take your weather with me if that's somehow possible, because it's 90 in Nebraska right now. So this has just been a cool, lovely few days, and I'm more than happy to be here. So I guess a little bit about what I do, because when I tell people I'm a food blogger, I feel like there's a little bit of confusion about what that means. What it means is that I wear a lot of hats. So I am a recipe developer. I do all my own research. I write my own recipes. I test my own recipes. I photograph my own recipes. I write a blog post, I publish it, and then I promote my recipes. So it is kind of an interesting combination of a lot of different skill sets, some of which I'm more skilled at than others, let's just put it that way. I'm a self-taught photographer, and I enjoy that piece of it, but I think the recipe writing really comes most naturally to me, and I think some of that is my attorney training. I really love the research piece of it. I love to kind of dive in and develop my own version of things. So tonight I want to talk to you a little bit about just some general baking tips, because I think there are some universal principles about baking that will just help you become a better baker overall, which is just, I think, kind of an important foundation for the Yule Log tradition. And then we're going to talk about 4 different types of Christmas cookies that are probably familiar to you. They're the 4 most popular cookies on my blog. So I think you're going to really enjoy kind of hearing some of the tips and tricks about why they work and what makes these recipes unique, and yeah, just kind of something that makes you successful in the kitchen yourself. So to start with, I just want to mention as a basic principle that baking is an art and a science with a huge emphasis on science. So if you're one of those cooks in the kitchen who likes to toss in a little bit of this and throw in a little bit of that, it doesn't work as well in the baking arena, because baking is quite largely chemistry, and it's based on a lot of ratios. It's about having the right amount of liquid to dry. It's about including the right amount of chemical leavener. That kind of brings me to my first tip, which is when you're getting started, it's important to follow the directions. Find that recipe source that you trust. I will vet any recipe on my site. Feel free to go there for the reliable recipes. Anyone who you know is writing decent recipes, and just follow the recipe. Kind of resist that urge to kind of make changes, at least when you get started. I think that's kind of important, and it's going to kind of help you ensure the success of what you're baking. Secondly, I'm sure you had this happen to you before, read the recipe all the way through before you bake. Some of these things seem obvious, but I think we've all gotten to a point, oh, I'm sorry, Lorianne, I'm talking and not flipping. Thank you. Okay, so yes, we've all been at that point where I wanted to serve these cookies tonight, and as it turns out, they needed an overnight rest in the fridge, and so I'm not gonna be able to do that. So just reading it all the way through, knowing what's coming, knowing any special equipment or ingredients you're gonna need, that's important to your success as well. Okay, so as I said, art and a science, so let's talk a little bit about the art. So let's say you wanna start making some substitutions. It's important to be thinking about what kind of substitutions are okay and which ones are maybe not such a great idea. So to begin with, and I kind of mentioned this already, chemical leaveners are designed to kind of go with the amount of liquid and dry ingredients that are in the recipe. So if you are starting with something and it has 1.5 teaspoons of baking powder, just go ahead and leave that alone. And the same thing goes for baking soda versus baking powder versus yeast. These are our 3 biggest chemical leaveners that you're gonna find in recipes, and they can't really be interchanged. And so if you are working with one in a recipe, just kind of leave it alone. Baking soda needs an acid to react with, whereas baking powder does not. So if you try to add baking soda to a recipe that doesn't have something like molasses or brown sugar or buttermilk, something like that that's acidic for it to react with, it just won't work at all. So again, we're back to that chemistry principle. As far as sugar goes, I know that granulated sugar gets kind of a bad rap these days, but it does have a lot of benefits in baking, even though it probably has 0 nutritional benefits whatsoever. It's hygroscopic, and that means that it attracts water, and it absorbs water during the baking process and slows the formation of gluten, and that creates a crispier final result. So white sugar really does have its place. I know people want to replace it. I get a lot of questions about how can I replace the white sugar in this recipe with honey or with molasses or with maple syrup, something that's more of a natural sweetener. And I always say that if you want to do that kind of substitution and you're working with something like, say, a quick bread or a muffin, something that's not super, super sweet, you can probably just go ahead and substitute those out. It'll be fine, it's not gonna be a big deal. But if you're working with a cake or cookies, something where there's a lot more sweetener, you're gonna have to start thinking about, again, that ratio of dry to wet ingredients, because honey is a liquid, and that's gonna change the texture of the entire batter or dough that you're working with. So if you really are interested in working with some of those natural sweeteners, it's best to seek out a recipe that's been designed that way to begin with, and rather than trying to sort of adapt something kind of going backwards. So bottom line, sugar might not be good for you, but it is your friend when it comes to baking, so something to keep in mind. Flour, that's another one that I get a lot of questions about. Most of our recipes that we tend to use, particularly in the Scandinavian baking world, start with all-purpose flour. And all-purpose flour has about an 11% protein content, and it's the protein in the flour that once it comes into contact with the liquid, and you're stirring it, you start to create a gluten network. And the gluten network is basically like a web. So once you form gluten, it's like a web of strands, and the chemical leavener will start to do its work in the oven, and it'll begin to expand, and you'll trap the gases inside, and you'll create that structure, and that's what makes your baked good. And that's what's so nice about glutinous flours, is that they do that for you. And I like to play around with flours, and if you go to my website, you'll see that I have recipes that include almond flour. I'll put that in quite a bit because it has a nice tenderizing quality to it, and it's very high in fat. In fact, it is just entirely ground almonds, so it has like 0 gluten, high fat content, but you can't just go in and replace 100% of your all-purpose flour with 100% of almond flour, because you won't find that structure. You won't get that rise. So my general rule of thumb is, if you want to start playing around with flour substitutions, substitute 1/3 of your all-purpose flour with something else. So let's say your recipe called for a cup of all-purpose flour. You could surely go ahead and substitute 1/3 of that with almond flour, for example, and then you have 2/3 cup of all-purpose flour. That would give you that nice tenderizing quality of the almond flour, but you would still have this structure. And sometimes I will add more, but I always start with 1/3 because I know it's kind of a safe ratio, and it's always gonna basically turn out. So if you want to kind of play around with adding some almond flours to your baked goods, I would definitely recommend it, especially for cakes. Not most of my cakes, but I have several that have some almond flour, and it really makes a nice texture. Another thing I like to play around with flours is adding some of the more historic Nordic flours like barley and rye to some of my baked goods, because you'll see those obviously in a lot of breads from the region, and that's because it's always a grain that's, or both of our grains that could grow in harsh conditions and with a short growing season. But really, they don't have to be just for bread baking. They make really nice additions to cookies, cakes, and scones. But like almond flour, they are a lot different than all-purpose flour. So barley and rye do have gluten in them, so don't feed them to your celiac friends, because they do have some gluten. But they're very low in gluten. So they have some of those same qualities as like an almond flour would have. They're kind of more tenderizing, and they have really interesting flavors. I mean, we all kind of know what the flavor of rye is. And barley is really nutty and sweet, and again, just makes a really delightful addition to your baked goods that it's kind of surprising and a little kind of old world Nordic. So I think it's just kind of a cool thing to do. And again, I will go back to that same ratio for those kinds of things. So if it calls for 1 cup of all-purpose flour, I'll do 1/3 cup rye, and then the rest all-purpose. And again, I might increase that amount if I kind of keep working with the recipe, but I pretty much know that that's going to be a safe place to start. And then other substitutions that are always good ideas is just adding 1 nut instead of another. So if a recipe calls for almonds, substituting hazelnuts, those things are completely safe to do and really fun to play around with. Adding chopped chocolate, nuts, dried fruit. or substituting one fruit for another. So if you're doing like a midsummer cake with strawberries, trying it later in the summer with peaches. You know, you can just kind of play around with things without changing that sort of baking structure that make a huge difference. Any questions about substitutions?
I have one.
Yeah.
What about like syrup or stevia or sugar?
I don't really work with artificial sweeteners, so I can't really speak to that. I'm sure they have instructions on the package for how you substitute that. And if you were going to kind of start playing around with artificial sweeteners, I think I would start with whatever like the manufacturer would recommend.
So you didn't mention anything about baking ammonia.
Baking ammonia.
You know,
And I noticed that your chocolate schnitt, which I make all the time, is not made with baking ammonia. As I
That's
can tell.
right. No, it's like one of those sort of personal preferences, and
It's the
Oldest leavening agent. And
Yes.
it has a very distinctive
scent
scent
while it's baking.
while it's baking. But did you know that in Ballard you can get it at every pharmacy because there's so many Scandinavians there?
Oh, that's so funny. Wow. See,
Yeah.
and that's the reason I don't use things like that is because it's kind of one of the principles of my blog is I try to make these recipes as accessible as they can be. So I try not to call for too many special ingredients. But yes, I completely respect the hardcore nature of the Seattle, you know, that's awesome that you can get that anywhere.
I find that a lot of recipes that call for sugar are too sweet for my taste, my family's taste. And I often use less sugar, and I'm wondering if sometimes by using less sugar, it fouls up all the ingredients.
Oh, you know what? I'm totally getting to that later. I have a little
Okay.
story about that because yes, I've had that experience too, especially with some Scandinavian cookies. I don't know why, but they tend to have they're very sweet, or at least they seem very sweet to me. But yeah, I'll get to that in a minute, a little story about my developing of a Krunkakka recipe. So, okay, so moving on a little bit from substitutions, I'm gonna just tell you my one tip for the night that I don't care if you listen to nothing else that I say for the rest of the night. This is the one to take home with you. Don't skip the salt. Salt in baked goods is so important. And people forget that all the time. And they just, you know, I don't even think they realize what a difference it makes. But if you think about like your tongue and you have like the bitter, sour, salty, sweet, something that has absolutely no salt in it is very one-dimensional in your mouth. And it just tastes flat. But if you add just a small amount of salt, it just really rounds everything out and almost like enhances the sweetness in a very pleasant way while making it, I guess balanced is the word. So my biggest recommendation to you is if you are finding a recipe and you have my permission to do this, even if you've never baked it before, go ahead and add some salt if it doesn't have any. So if you have pretty much like a standard sized cake or cookie recipe, I'd probably start with a half teaspoon of fine sea salt or just regular table salt. If it's a smaller recipe, I might go down to a quarter teaspoon. But I always add salt. The only caveat that I'm gonna make with respect to salt is if you use salted butter to bake with. So I think some of our older recipes were intended to be made with salted butter, and they didn't even specify it because it wasn't a question at the time. But nowadays, in a modern recipe, they will either specify salted or unsalted butter. All of my recipes call for unsalted butter because I just like to be able to control that myself. But if you bake with salted butter, you can pretty much count on each stick having anywhere between a half teaspoon and 3/4 teaspoon of salt already in it. Isn't that shocking? Yeah. So if you use salted butter, you have my permission to leave the salt out. If you do not, please add it. It will make a huge difference. And that's kind of what you were saying with the overly sweet baked goods. Sometimes that's just not having any salt in it because it just doesn't have that background kind of to round everything out. So yes, you can all leave now if that was all you came for because that is my best tip of the night. Okay, don't overmix your batter or dough. You probably already know this, but when you overmix, it's gonna lead to a tough rather than tender baked good. So as we talked a little bit about with our gluten conversation, once the flour and the dry ingredients come into contact with the liquid ingredients and you start stirring, you're activating the gluten network. And as you keep stirring, you're strengthening the gluten network. And that's just gonna create a more, a stronger and more elastic network. And there's probably something you can think of where that's a good thing, right? Bread. And we need bread because we want that strong network. But when it comes to a cookie or a cake, we don't want that strong network. We just want enough support to give us the leavening we want, and we still want to have a tender bake it. So I just come in with a rubber spatula. I just do enough of this kind of gentle folding action until I just have a few streaks of flour remaining. I mean, it doesn't even have to all be incorporated, because once you go to move your batter into a cake pan or wherever it's going, that's going to sort of take care of itself. So a really light hand with the mixing once the wet and the dry come together is critical. My final tip is just make things more than once. I feel like in our culture, we're kind of like, hey, I'm gonna try something new all the time, and that's so fun. And it is fun, but the more that you develop your own sort of repertoire of recipes that are yours and you feel super comfortable with them, and you kind of start to figure out, oh, this happened last time, it didn't happen this time, you just become a better baker. Just like anything else, practice makes perfect. So I encourage you to kind of work with the same recipes a few times and kind of, just really build up from there. So with that, we can start talking about cookies. Unless anyone has any questions about just general baking.
Do you prefer cream? Do you prefer creamery butter over basic butter?
I do prefer that, like a European style butter. They're so delicious and they're great for baking. They have a higher butter fat content than American butter. So they're a little bit more rich, they contain less water. They're very, very nice for baking. I don't generally call for them because, again, we're talking about accessibility here. But yes, if you're on that program, yes, do that. It's delicious.
The other recommendation that I would have for people, because it happens to me too often, is to look for the expiration date on your baking soda.
Yes, that's happened to me before too. She mentioned that baking soda and baking powder both have expiration dates. So always check those. If you're not baking in regular rotation, make sure it's still active, because it will sort of go bad on you and then nothing will rise and you'll be sad. So that's a good tip. Thank you. Anyone else? Let's talk cookies. So these are my raspberry hazelnut thumbprint cookies, and I am Swedish, I am Norwegian, and I am Danish. I speak neither or none of the three. So could someone please pronounce Holland for me properly? Someone has. Whoever said that was lovely. Beautiful. Okay, perfect. I'm not even going to attempt it. That was perfect. So basically, these are just it means raspberry cave in Swedish, which is the perfect name for these little buttery cookies with a divot of jam in the center. So why this recipe works, this is a good example of my, is it changing? No. When I was talking before about using almond flour, here I'm using toasted ground hazelnuts in conjunction with some all-purpose flour, which kind of has that same effect. Something to mention about toasted nuts, they have a lot more nut flavor than the untoasted. So if you want that really pronounced nut flavor, go ahead and toast those nuts before you grind them. If you don't want that pronounced nut flavor, which is sometimes the case, you just want it to be more of a background note, don't go ahead and toast them. This raspberry jam is a really nice fruity counterpoint to this kind of buttery hazelnut cookie. If I've done strawberry before, I've done blueberry, and they're all really good, but there's something about that deep raspberry flavor that offsets the buttery cookie here that is just absolute money. And then finally, these are baked in the little mini paper baking cups, so like a little mini muffin cup. And that is the traditional Swedish way to do them, and it keeps them just a little bit softer, protecting them from the heat of the oven, and they're just crispy on the top and then really tender throughout. They are just absolutely delicious. And you can bake them without the cup. I've done it many times. They will just be a little bit more crispy all the way through. So I highly recommend the cup because it's a little bit unique and it really creates an extra nice cookie. Okay, so your tips for baking raspberry hazelnut thumbprints. Again, use the mini baking cups. Don't overmix the dough, which we've already talked about. And then taking time to reinforce the well that's in the center of the cookie before you fill it with jam. So you're gonna make a little ball of dough, put it into a baking cup, and then use a rounded teaspoon to make a little divot. And then once it bakes in the oven, the divot kind of comes back up a little bit. So once it comes out of the oven, I will take the time while the cookie is still warm and push back down in that divot so that I have more space for jam. So, and then I use that same size of teaspoon to just spoon the jam into the center, and that way I know I've got the right amount, and it keeps things nice and clean. So the next cookie we're going to talk about is the Krunkakka. Krunkakka means bent cake in Norwegian, which is fitting as this waffle cookie is pressed inside a decorative iron and then wrapped around a cone shape. I'm sure you guys already know this. And they are delicious and delicate, but they sometimes have that problem of being overly sweet. So when I started developing this recipe, I wanted to cut back the sugar quite a bit. And I tried that, and I cut back the sugar, and I cut back the sugar. And as I kept cutting it back, I noticed I was losing my texture. Suddenly those cookies weren't as crisp anymore. And I did some research, and as it turns out that the sugar, when it's baking in that little iron, it's melting, and then once it comes out of the iron and cools, it's recrystallizing, and that's helping create that crisp texture. So the sugar in this cookie is serving more of a role than just kind of sweetness and browning. It's also creating that really nice texture. So I actually was able to cut back on the sugar to some extent, but only so far, and that was just kind of the way of it. Other tips for making these work, oh actually, I'm sorry, I'm just gonna go back here. So I added a little bit of cornstarch to the batter, which is something I saw in a few recipes that I went through, and that really made a huge difference in making them more tender and crisp. So just a couple tablespoons of cornstarch will make a huge difference. Again, adding that little bit of salt will help balance out with that feel, like that overly sweet kind of vibe that you get from those sometimes. And then my secret ingredient is brown butter. I don't know if any of you are familiar with brown butter. So if you're gonna have to melt butter anyway, and you want a little more flavor in something, you can always turn it into brown butter. And what that means is you take your butter, you put it in a skillet, you put it on the stove, and you start swirling. Your butter's gonna melt. It's over like medium-low heat at this point. And then once it melts, the milk solids are gonna start to turn kind of a golden brown. It's gonna get this really nice, like nutty aroma, and then you kind of know your butter's ready to work with. So at that point, I will take it off the stove. I will pour it into a heat-proof bowl, because if I leave it in the skillet, it'll overcook just from the heat of the skillet. And then I just let that cool until I'm ready to use it. And it just adds a really nice caramel toasty note to anything that you add it to. And it's particularly nice in something like Krunkakka because it's such a simple cookie. You can really taste that extra richness. So yeah, I highly recommend that. And it's certainly nothing new. I can't say I invented it. The great Beatrice Ojakangas, I'm sure we all know the Scandinavian baking book. She has several recipes that call for brown butter, so I can't take credit for that. So, as I said, don't cut back on the sugar. I'm gonna move my thing forward here. Include that a short rest time for the batter. It helps it kind of hydrate and, again, produces a more crispy cookie. Bake each Krunkakka until it is nicely browned. I think we have a tendency to take them off too soon before they're fully crisped and browned, so let them go, let them get nice and toasty, and that will help keep them crisp. Cool them completely on a wire rack before storing. Any sort of warm cookie is still gonna have moisture in it, so once it's trapped inside with other cookies inside an airtight container, everybody's doomed and it's gonna be soggy city for all your cookies. And then choose the right storage container. This might be a myth, but I've tried it and I truly believe that that metal cookie tin is the way to go with a cookie like this. It has just enough breathability that it's not completely airtight. I line mine with some paper towels and I feel like they do stay a little bit more crisp that way. So it's worth seeking those out, or maybe you have some of those nice sort of old-fashioned ones around. I know my mom does. Okay, so these are my Swedish ginger snaps, my pepper popper. These are very special to me. This is my great-grandmother's recipe. And she brought this over from Sweden when she emigrated to the United States in the late 1880s. My grandmother was known for hosting legendary fika gatherings, and this was one of her signature cookies that she would serve. So It's very special to my family, and I think it was in an issue of the Norwegian American last year. Yeah. So, yeah, they're so, so good. Okay, I'm gonna just move this forward. Okay, so why this recipe works. The whole trick to this recipe is that it uses pastry flour rather than all-purpose flour. When we talked a little bit earlier about protein content in flours, and I told you that all-purpose flour was at 11%, pastry flour is at 9%. So it's a little bit more low protein, it's a little bit softer, it's really fine, almost like dust. It's very, very finely ground and produces exceptionally tender baked goods. So the pastry flour here just makes this cookie that has kind of like, it's super thin, it has a crispy outside and a tender inside, and it's really like nothing else that you'll find. When I tested this recipe, I tested it with all-purpose flour because, again, I'm trying to go for accessibility. I want this to be easy for you. I don't want you to have to go out and get anything special. I also tried a homemade pastry flour where it's a part cornstarch, part all-purpose flour. Did not do the same thing. They're all delicious. You could make this cookie with any of those flours and they will still be yummy, but they will not have that super special crispy outside, tender inside, super thin thing going on. So it's worth seeking out the pastry flour. I get mine on Amazon. I like the Bob's Red Mill brand, so it's not hard to find. And you might even be able to find it locally. Some stores will have it. So the tips for making this work, obviously pastry flour, chilling the dough properly because that pastry flour makes it super soft and hard to work with, so making sure it's really, really cold before you start rolling out little balls. The balls should not be more than 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch in diameter. That's because they're gonna spread like crazy and we don't want you to have one big ginger snap. We want you to have a bunch of little ginger snaps. So making them small is important, and you'll have a tendency, if you're me, because you're impatient, and as you go along, you'll start making them larger. Because you're like, okay, am I done yet? But go for small. And then before I bake these cookies, I roll each little ball in sugar, and then I dip the bottom of a glass in sugar, and I just flatten it so it's about 1/2 inch into a disc before baking. And that kind of gives it it kind of accentuates that crispy exterior, tender interior that's going on. Okay. Lastly, we're going to talk about almond tarts. When I started this recipe, this was one of the first recipes I developed for the blog, and I made me really think that, you know, there's so many cookies that we only make at Christmas. Why do we only make these at Christmas? They're so good. They're just like a little pastry shell. I'm gonna make them in the spring, and I'm gonna put a little strawberry rhubarb compote inside and a little dollop of whipped cream on top. And it just kind of got me thinking that, you know, maybe we shouldn't just eat these things in December. Maybe we should be enjoying them all year long. So these are really basic, and they have a nice almond flavor. They have all-purpose flour, butter, and ground almonds. The dough is very easy to work with to press into those little tins that you need to make these. It's a really good baking project for kids. I'm actually doing a kit. It's sponsored by the Vesterheim. They do a lot of work through their folk school with baking and other folk arts. And it's gonna be a kit for kids in baking, and it comes with the little tins and the recipe, and they can kind of make these on their own, so that should be fun. So my tips for making almond tartlet success, let me just move this forward. I'm bad at this, sorry. So again, chilling the dough for at least 30 minutes before you work with it, because it's just gonna help you get a more even texture throughout your little almond tartlet, because otherwise it presses almost too easily. Not greasing the tart pans. I know this is a little bit controversial, but I've tried it all the ways. I've done the baking spray, I've done butter, I've done it without anything at all, and honest to God, I cannot tell the difference between the three. So if you don't wanna take the time to grease every little tin, don't do it. It's really, I don't think you need to do it. You can write me a nasty email if you're sick, I promise, I'll respond. Press the dough into the tart pans thinly and evenly without driving yourself insane. I know that my mom had a friend who really prized herself on her very thin almond tarts, and it kind of put me off making it because I thought, well, I don't know if I can do that. And then I thought, well, that's silly. I didn't have to be that thin. It can just be however I want them to be. So, you know, be reasonable with yourself. No need for perfection. And then once you're done pressing your dough into those little pans, just kind of finishing it off with your finger on the top so it's nice and neat. And then once the tart pans have cooled, just kind of giving them a little wiggle so that they kind of release, and that just takes a little practice and then you get the hang of it. And kind of like Krunkakka, if you want to fill these with something like a whipped cream or, like I said, some fruit compote or whatever you choose, it's probably best not to do it too far in advance so they get soggy. So just kind of waiting till the last minute and then, going ahead and filling them. So those were kind of the main points I was interested in making tonight. And I just want to encourage everyone to really, get those old recipes out. Just thinking about bringing that tradition of Yule Bak forward, I think as a recipe developer, that's kind of what I do. I take recipes and I try to update them and make them really accessible for the next generation, because I think that language of baking that everyone understood maybe 1 or 2 generations ago is kind of gone. And I know if my daughters tried to read something that my grandmother had written, she wouldn't be able to bake it. So maybe taking a few minutes this holiday season and kind of fleshing out the details of some of those recipes that are really important to you, that you want to see carried forward. I know a lot of people always say, and this is fantastic if you have the time, get your kids in the kitchen or get your grandkids and bake this with them. But I think sometimes we put that off, and then suddenly, no one can make grandma's recipe and she's not here to ask the questions. And so, being proactive, taking those notes, maybe, just like I said, fleshing out the details so that you can kind of carry these forward. So that would be my last little message to you tonight. Are there any other questions? Yes.
Do you ever make a filling for your Krunkakka? Or is that?
A filling?
Yes.
I do. I usually just do whipped cream and strawberries, but then I've been playing with cardamom whipped cream and a little bit of lingonberry whipped cream. I mean, there's so many different things you can do. Does anybody
That sounds
else?
good.
Oh, they're delicious. Does anybody else do anything really interesting with their Krunkakka? Or I think a lot of people just serve them plain. Yeah?
I didn't know that was acceptable.
Oh, it's acceptable. You can do whatever you want, I promise. Anything else? Yes?
I have been looking for it's a Swedish potato cookie, and there was a lady at the Swedish Club that used to make them every bake sale, and I haven't seen them before, well, obviously on COVID, but does anyone know what they're called? Like, I searched them.
Swedish potato
She
cookies?
makes them with potato flour. I think her name
Oh.
might have been.
Oh, we've got somebody back here who might know. Oh, yay!
Yeah, they're called sand nuts, or they were in
Oh,
my
yes.
family.
Yes,
And
yes,
it's
yes.
made with a combination of potato flour and the all-purpose flour and lots of butter. Well, we call them sand nuts. Okay. Yeah, I'll get your email.
This is great. This is turning into a recipe exchange. This could not be better. I thought maybe you wouldn't even need my talk now that we have boxes of cookies, but now you have to all bake for the sale, so. Oh, okay, she was talking about, did you hear the question about the Swedish potato cookie? So she asked if anyone knew if there was someone here who used to make a Swedish potato cookie that she loved, and some kind person in the back said that she had the recipe. So yeah, we're facilitating recipe exchange here, yeah. Anything else? Well, thank you so much. This has just been a pleasure, and I'm so happy to be in Seattle. What a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, I don't know about you, but I actually learned quite a bit tonight. I've been baking for many years, and above all, I'm very inspired to do some baking this season, and then to eat it as well. So, I just wanted to give some special thanks to Kristi once again for coming all the way from Omaha, Nebraska for this evening. Let's give her another hand. Kristi Olsen Field, who is our Taste of Norway editor, really put an enormous amount of work into this special Christmas cookie issue that we did. Her son just started school this week and she wasn't able to come, but she really went beyond the call of duty for this issue, and she always does for everything. And Madison Laren, who could not be here tonight either because she was our photographer, and she makes these wonderful Norse masks too. I think I even see Eric wearing a Swedish one there. Here's one here. She really made this a work of art with her photography, so it was wonderful. And you saw some of the photos in this PowerPoint presentation. And then Christine Leander, who so graciously opened up her home one Sunday afternoon in the middle of the pandemic, and I arrived with big bins of Christmas decorations, and she pulled everything out of her basement to stage this amazing photo shoot. So please give Kristi a hand. She's so generous and supportive of us all. And then finally, I urge you to connect with your community, your food community. You can do that by following Kristi's blog, True North Kitchen. It's not just cookie recipes, it's all kinds of delicious recipes from the Nordic countries, and they all turn out and they're all delicious. And then of course, I strongly urge you to subscribe to this newspaper. It is focused on Norway, but it really offers up a lot of information about all the Nordic countries and what's going on in the Nordic American community throughout North America. We've really worked to get some very interesting features, not just cookies. We had a big interview with Dr. Michael Osterholm for our last issue, who said some very interesting things about the pandemic. For example, politicians, artists, activities. We're gonna do something covering ABBA to celebrate what's happening. And then of course, this is a great time to subscribe because there'll be so much content throughout the whole holiday season. So I just want to say velkommen, as you would say Norwegian as well, to both True North Kitchen and the Norwegian American, and wish you happy baking.